Now, interestingly, Briahna Joy Gray was not even the first person fired by The Hill for criticizing Israel. In October of 2022, Jacobin, the left-wing magazine, reported on a case of Katie Halper, who herself is a Jewish journalist. She had been also working for the same program where Briahna was fired from yesterday, called Rising. And there you see left-wing journalist Katie Halper has been fired for calling Israel an apartheid state. Are you allowed in the United States to call Israel an apartheid state? We've shown you many times before that in September of 2023, a month before the October 7th attack, the former head of the Mossad, appointed to that position by Benjamin Netanyahu in 2015, said that Israel had become an apartheid state because of the fact that they were about to be the minority rulers of a majority of Arabs, excuse the phrase, between the river and the sea. Now, speaking of between the river and the sea, I wrote an article back in, here, by the way, from NBC News, was an article on CNN firing Mark Lamont Hill, their longtime commentator, and he was fired after his speech on Israel draws outrage. He essentially gave a speech in which he said that we think it's important that Palestinians be free from the river to the sea. And for that, yet another journalist, Mark Lamont Hill, an American journalist, was fired from his job for criticizing Israel in a way that people found offensive. And I've been writing about this for so many years. Back in 2010, a longtime producer for CNN who covered the Mideast region for them, Octavia Nazar, was fired by CNN. It was a summary dismissal by CNN of a 20-year employee who had nothing but positive reviews. And the reason she got fired was because she expressed solidarity or positive sentiments for a mullah in Lebanon who had been linked to Hezbollah, simply saying essentially like my sentiments for people who knew him. He was very popular in Lebanon. And this is somebody that you're not allowed to criticize because he's deemed to be anti-Israel. And she was instantly fired from her job in journalism after 20 years. This is a pattern that goes back many, many, many years. And Briahna is only the latest example of someone who was fired from her job for criticizing Israel in a way that was deemed excessive. Now, we're about to go talk to Briahna. She is, for those of you who don't know, a lawyer. She is also a longtime journalist. She was my former colleague at The Intercept, where we worked together for about a year and a half, 2 years, and then she left in order to become the press secretary of the 2020 Bernie Sanders campaign. And after that, over the last several years, she has become the very popular host of the morning news show Rising, which is a show produced by the longtime Washington media outlet called The Hill. And it was yesterday when Briahna received word out of nowhere with no explanation that she was being fired at exactly the same time that she'd become a major source of indignation and contempt and hatred on the part of the pro-Israel faction in the United States. I'm always delighted to speak with Briahna, and tonight is no exception. Briahna, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me, Glenn, and thank you, I have to say, for being just so consistent on this particular issue, especially when so many others have demonstrated that there is a free speech exception that is very much Israel-shaped.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, one of the things I've always tried to argue when I've been defending people on the right who are fired or censored or otherwise punished for their views is that it doesn't matter whether you like that person, whether you like their views. What matters is the principle that you want to affirm. Do you want to live in a society in which people are required to recite certain ideological orthodoxies in order to be heard in media, to keep their job in journalism? Or do you want to live in a society where there's actually free speech, where people are permitted to involve themselves in debates, even with views that are unpopular, and not lose their job over it? And especially in journalism, academia, that's really the place most of all where we need this kind of free discourse. So let's talk about your situation. I just went through this long history that I know you know of all the people in the United States who have been fired over many years, and particularly since October 7th, for criticizing the state of Israel in some way or supporting the Palestinian cause. You know those risks to your career, and yet you have become, since October 7th, one of the most visible and vocal critics of the state of Israel, of its war in Gaza, of the Palestinian cause. Why was that a risk that you were willing to take? And I should say, I think the risk is even higher for people like yourself who aren't Jewish. People who are Jewish can get fired, like Norman Finkelstein, but have a little bit more protection. But you were particularly vulnerable, I think, in part for that reason. Why was this cause something that you were willing to risk your job over?
Yeah, well, for one, I always saw my choice to work at Rising in the first place as driven by my desire to use a large corporate media platform to articulate left politics, which are largely excluded from any kind of mainstream discourse. It was, for me, primarily, frankly, exclusively, it was about my ability to use the platform to advance a kind of politics that I feel passionately about. And the money is just an ancillary benefit on the side. And especially after Katie was fired from The Hill, my feeling was that it was my obligation, frankly, to test the premise that the CEO, Bob Cusack, had put out there at the time, which was that Katie's firing was not ideological, that they had some other sort of issue with the way the radar that she had written that was ostensibly the cause for her firing. These radars are our video essays that we deliver direct to camera. What they had told her was that her radar was somehow not up to the standard, that it had been written in a way that was not consistent with The Hill's editorial direction. And that's why she was let go, not because of the content of the radar. So what I said was, I'm going to go full bore on this issue in particular, obviously not knowing at the time that October 7th was going to make it the issue in domestic and international politics. But it was really important to me to not pull any punches, in part because I did not want to validate in any way The Hill's reasoning that they did not already fire a contributor for ideological reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously empathize the minute you're a journalist and someone's telling you that you can't say certain things or can't report certain things. That is no longer a job that any person with any dignity should maintain. That's what I said when I quit my own media outlet at The Intercept. And I wish that there were a lot more people who thought that way. All right, let's talk about the firing itself. You were notified of your termination by an email that you were sent by The Hill yesterday, and just to add insult to injury, they didn't even bother to spell your name correctly. And they essentially just said, effective immediately, you are fired. It didn't contain any reasons for it. There's the email on the screen, and people can see that it's just a very kind of deliberately summary dismissal. Have you received any word from them, either since the firing or before, that they had a problem with things that you were saying about Israel?
Yes and no. So I have not had any communication with anybody from The Hill about the firing. The producer, Joanne Levine, has not returned any of my phone calls. I immediately reached out after I received this letter, in part because it wasn't clear to me from the text whether the 30 days referenced in the letter meant that they expected me to finish out the month, or whether or not Wednesday was my last day in office. And I texted her several times saying, look, I don't need to have a conversation with you. Can you just clarify that one point? It's so I can start talking about this publicly. You know what I mean? So no, to date, I've heard from nobody except for Robbie, who has been on vacation and who is frustrated by all of this as well.
And to be clear, Robbie, it's Robbie Sawabi, who's your co-host, with whom you have a lot of disagreements, including on Israel.
Right. Yes, very publicly on the show. That's the whole point of the show. But behind the scenes, off camera, he's very supportive of our of what we're trying to do on the show, of the project, of the show itself, and is very protective of it, and was very frustrated and disappointed in the actions that The Hill took. But I want to add some more context. I have been under a great deal of pressure for months and months now to tone down my Israel coverage at Rising. It started, I think, really in earnest about 6 months ago or so, when there was a radical shift in the staff at The Hill, where basically every single person who worked there was either fired or pushed out. The work environment was so difficult that they chose to leave, basically. And as new staff replaced them, particularly new producers who exerted much more editorial control over the content than had ever been exerted before, they particularly put a lot of scrutiny on coverage of Israel and started to refer to our coverage as an Israel block. So we do about 8 to 12 blocks, segments a day, and they started to refer to this idea of an Israel block, where we could only do one segment on Israel. And as you can imagine, Glenn, given the plethora of stories that come out on a daily basis, some of them are domestic politics issues, some of them are straight news reporting about whatever bombing campaign most recently happened in, let's say, Rafah. Some of them are about the choice to have Netanyahu come to speak to Congress. You might have a story about what happened on a college campus protest. You might have a story on and on and on. You could easily do 12 segments on Israel every day. And they were segments that were very popular with rising audience. Unlike some other, I've been on the other side of that, right? I've had to talk about issues that I'm the foil for, I'm the heel for with that particular very ideologically mixed audience. But on Israel, it was a double header of a lot of clicks, earns money for the company, and is also something that's very newsy, and is something that ideologically I personally cared a lot about. And yet, unlike other subjects that were very newsy, let's say when we talked about a lot of COVID coverage, talked about some culture issues with trans issues and the like, there was never the same resistance to covering it as much as the audience wanted as there was when it came to Israel.
So I think there are two important things to note here. Number one is that this is not a foreign war. This is an American war. The United States government is paying for this war. It's arming the Israelis. And I think most importantly of all, it has completely isolated itself on the world stage. So often there are votes at the UN where the only two no votes in the world are the United States and Israel. And the rest of the world either is voting yes to criticize Israel, to stop Israel, or there's a couple dozen countries in the middle that are abstaining. And so as an American, of course this is the war you're going to talk about, not even because it's a war. It's like the war in Ukraine. It's also an American war as well. And the other thing that I think is so important, what you said, and I actually wanted to ask you about this, is it would be one thing if you had your own show and you were just there spouting what the company considered, let's call it anti-Israel propaganda, and there was nobody rebutting it or checking it. For anyone who was seeing this show, you had right next to you your co-host, Robbie Suavi, who I know well, and but on this topic, he pretty much has been defending Israel vociferously, and you and he have had some very strident arguments. In fact, often, almost the kind that you wouldn't expect for two co-workers to have, because that's how open these disagreements and disputes were. Can you talk a little bit more, though, about the idea? Because obviously, if the Hill could point to the fact that your commentary on Israel was harming their ratings or their views or their profit, that would be one thing. But talk a little bit more about what that data shows.
Yeah, not at all. In fact, the numbers at the Hill have been down significantly again since this whole staff turnover earlier this year, in part because it almost feels, frankly, like they've been trying to sabotage the show for a long time. For example, the edict came down earlier this year that we weren't allowed to respond to clips. And as you know, Glenn, so much of doing a kind of an internet show is responding to, viral clips, whether they're, Tucker Carlson sat down with an interview with Thomas Massey, or Whoopi Goldberg said something silly on The View. I mean, that's so much of what the coverage is. But there was this decision to not disallow us from doing that. That caused a real steep decline in the kinds of segments we could do. There have been I've been outright told that certain kinds of guests couldn't come on. For example, I was told that Norm Finkelstein, you brought him up earlier, the foremost scholar on Gaza in the entire country, if not the world, was banned because they said he was a, quote, Holocaust denier. This is someone whose parents survived the Holocaust themselves. So this is the kind of pressure that we've been under. And as much as you see me arguing with Robbie on air, that is our job. In many ways, it has been more tense behind the scenes because of the editorial control that they have been trying to wrest over me personally. I think Robbie, frankly, he'll speak for himself at some point, I'm sure, but has been under a lot of pressure to push back against me in ways that maybe are even artificial to his own belief structure, because the show desired, people at the company desired there to be balance, even if this is not necessarily an issue where there are both sides. And I think that's ultimately what led to the interview, which is being held up as the pretext for my firing. Let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you there, because actually exactly what I wanted to ask you about, and we're going to show that clip. I wanted to talk to you about it. But just to give a little context to this, I've definitely been noticing that you have been kind of ascending as a target by pro-Israel fanatics. I mean, they've been really going after you. You do this debate
recently where it was very contentious and the supposed neutral host, Konstantin Kizin, began attacking you in very vicious ways, calling you a DEI Barbie, and then pathetically and cowardly denying that he was referring in any way to your race.
Made.
Yeah, exactly. It could be your. Yeah. You should change your Twitter name to that. But clearly the fact that you are out there, that you do have this kind of platform in corporate media where you've been using it to be so vocal in your criticism of Israel has really made you public enemy number one. But as you say, that really escalated when this very short snippet of an interview that you conducted with, I believe she's the sister of a hostage in Gaza. Is that correct? She's the sister of a hostage in Gaza.
That's correct.
And it was at the very end of the interview, so there was no context to it, but they tried to claim that you were essentially mocking and rolling your eyes at a rape victim. Let's show this video that caused so much disturbance.
Thank you. Me too. And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right. Thanks for joining. Stick around. More Rising coming up next.
Now, Briahna, I honestly never knew that there were so many people on the right who embrace this phrase, believe women. But ever since October 7th, they've been kind of chanting and marching around with their fist in the air, chanting this like they're Gloria Steinem or something. I mean, before October 7th, the idea was, no, we don't believe women. We want to see evidence. And you can question the evidence. I guess that is yet another view that changed. But what happened there? Were you mocking and rolling your eyes at Israeli rape victims, or explain what it is that you were doing?
Of course not. And I am hesitant to give the Hill more clicks at this point, but I do encourage people to go and listen to the whole interview, because there's a couple of things. One is that this is not someone that the Hill reached out to. They weren't looking for a guest who was a family member of a hostage, or who gave the perspective of what those family members are going to. This person offered themselves up, and very specifically when making the request, said that they wanted to talk to me. And when our producer, Joanne, forwarded the request to me, I don't have the exact language in front of me, but immediately a red flag went up, because it seemed to me that this was someone who had a personal vendetta and agenda against me. And I was cautioning Joanne against having yet another person on that wanted to litigate what they found distasteful about my own personal political views in the context of a show where I, as a host, really don't have the opportunity to go back and forth. I have to, moderate a show, be gracious to the person who has come there. But when they sort of open the door to personal attacks, it upsets the balance in a way that I don't think is really appropriate for the show. But I was in a position where I was under a great deal of pressure, once again, to have balance in the coverage that was happening on the show, despite the fact that my radars were one of the only well-performing segments that were happening on the Hill at the time, because of the decline in viewership, that I was alluding to before. So throughout this interview, it was I think very fine. I think her perspective is valuable and necessary. We were talking about her sister, how hard it is for her to be separated from her. It was a compelling story. But then she started to interject political claims into the narrative. She made an Islamophobic comment, suggesting that there was going to be terrorism in Dearborn, Michigan, because I suppose it's the largest Arab American community, so we should be afraid of what might happen in Dearborn. She talked about the now well discredited mass rape hoax on October 7th. Suggesting that the Zaka organization that perpetuated many of those claims was credible, and that if I only had listened to Zaka, that I would understand what had happened on October 7th, and that her sister could be under similar threats of violence. And certainly it could be the case that her sister could be under threats of sexual violence. But she forced me, frankly, to push back against discredited false claims about events that did not happen on October 7th. And as I did that, she seemed to grow increasingly agitated. She would pivot between saying that she didn't want to talk about politics. And I said, okay, well, tell me about your sister. We'd love to hear about your sister. And then she would interject politics back into it. When I tried to ask her how she felt as the family of a hostage victim, about how Benjamin Netanyahu has been handling the return of the hostages, he has been protested, as you well know, in Israel for not prioritizing the return of the hostages, instead saying that he wants to obliterate Hamas before thinking about agreeing to any of these ceasefire deals. She again pivoted away, said she's not a politician, doesn't know about politics. But then, of course, toward the end, increasingly tried to make it personal about me. I pushed back the little bit that you saw there at the end. And frankly, that eye roll and exasperation is more about the stupidity of my producer making the choice to have this guest on who very predictably was going to make it into a personal attack about me than about that woman herself. And I would point out that Hind Medzig and another guest, Israeli guest, or I think she was actually an Iranian Zionist guest, have done the exact same thing when they've come on and then clipped the episodes afterward to launch very personal media attacks against me with a swarm of bots that we now know from reporting over the past week is coming directly from the Israeli government.
You know, it's always been bizarre to me since October 7th that the excuse for destroying all of Gaza, for obliterating it, for blowing it all up, and for starving it is they're doing it for the hostages. Because if I were a family member of a hostage in Gaza, and many family members of hostages in Gaza have said this repeatedly, the last thing I'd want is for my own government to be bombing the crap indiscriminately out of the place where my family member was and to be starving them. You had hostages who were released as part of that exchange early on, and many of them came out and said, my biggest fear were Israeli bombs. And they talked about how there was often a shortage of food, not because Hamas was starving them, but they even said Hamas was sharing with them and eating the exact portions that they were eating. And so to even make her representative as if she's speaking for all hostage family members is itself a distortion. But I think the important thing I want to delve into a little bit more is the great taboo here has always been questioning things that were said in the weeks after October 7th about what happened on October 7th, even though we know for sure it's provably true that so many of the things that were said, particularly the worst things, turned out to be absolute lies. They said that Hamas had beheaded babies. They said that they put them in ovens, that they cut them out of the wombs. As it turns out, Haaretz documented that a grand total of one baby, Israeli baby, was killed on October 7th. These were all grotesque lies. They had Joe Biden say he saw photos of beheaded babies, even though that never happened. And then, of course, the big article that purported to step up and say we're about to tell the truth and verify this mass rape claim was a New York Times article that even within the Times, because of so much journalistic sketchiness, the need to retract certain things, people saying they were quoted in certain ways that they didn't believe, it turned into a huge scandal. And the New York Times, when they went to submit Pulitzer nominations, notably excluded that article. So there's all kinds of questions about the nature of these claims. Can you talk a little bit about some of the uncertainties or the things that have been disproven about those kind of claims?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because even covering that story on the Hill has been particularly difficult, even within the context of the broader Gaza siege. In one particular instance, I remember wanting to cover, I don't remember whose reporting it was, whether it was the Gray Zone or Mondo Weiss, or, but one of the exposés that had been basically revealed the inconsistencies in the New York Times reporting and really blew the lid off of the mass rape hoax as it's come to be known. And when I proposed it as a block, our producer, again, Joanne Levine, said, I don't know about this. Why don't you, this feels like a radar. Why don't you do it as a radar? So just, I can hear you. Sorry, whoever that was just talking in the background there from the show.
Okay, good.
Sorry. But, it sounds like a radar. Basically, she was trying to turn what was a news story into a personal opinion story to put distance between it and the show. And again, I was not required to do radars. Part of my deal here was that I was going to go from 3 days to 4 days about a year ago and no longer be required to do these radars, which are pretty time consuming. I started doing radars again after October 7th with great frequency because it was really the only way I could get coverage of Gaza-related stories into the lineup. So that was one instance where in particular there was a clear discomfort around even covering the mass rape hoax story. Of course, when I did cover it, I did turn it into a radar. It was, again, one of the best performing blocks that we had. But yeah, I want to give an enormous amount of credit to the Gray Zone and Mondo Weiss and the Squirrel Twitter account and all of the people who have been scrutinizing the blatantly from the record, from the New York Times' record, inconsistent claims about what was alleged to have happened on October 7th. 7th. And even just, I believe today, was it the London Times finally is one of the more mainstream outlets that is now going back into the Pramila Patten UN report that was held up as corroborating evidence of sexual assault on October 7th when it did exactly the opposite. She said she looked through hundreds and thousands of images and video hours of the cameras that Hamas was wearing and the like, and did not see any evidence of rape in any of that imagery. And yet we still have Sheryl Sandberg and the like performatively on camera saying that they're looking at evidence of rape that we know was not actually uncovered by the UN. And in fact, in the interview with the sister of the Hamas hostage on the Hill, she says that she also saw this video that the UN says, after examining all of the video and documentary evidence that there was, did not demonstrate, despite seeing a lot of horrible things, no doubt, did not see any evidence of sexual assault on October 7th.
You know, I think that's the key point. Like, there were obviously terrible atrocities on October 7th, as people now say, as always happens in war. I mean, there were clearly civilians who were murdered, Israeli civilians, in terrible and gruesome ways, in ways that were often intentional. But the truth also matters. Like, to question claims, these maximalist claims, doesn't mean you're denying the things that happened on October 7th inside Israel that were very worthy of condemnation. You know, every time we have a certain one of these events, there's always lies told about it. I mean, back when the Bush administration wanted to go to war with Iraq over Kuwait, they made up claims about how Saddam Hussein was pulling babies out of incubators. You know, the Vietnam War started with lies. The other Iraq War started with lies. I remember when the Obama administration killed Osama bin Laden, they immediately released a whole string of lies to emotionally manipulate people to support it, claiming that he was shooting at them, that he had held up his wife as a shield in front of him to show what a coward he was. None of this turned out to be true. So the idea that we can't even, that we're willing to accept immediately everything that's claimed to one of these events, let alone agree that we can't question it, is amazing to me. I just have a little bit of time left with you. Let me just ask you, this whole idea that you can't, that you risk your job if you criticize this foreign country, even though you're an American citizen living in your own country, and that you're free to say anything you want, no matter how vicious or nasty, about American leaders and American government officials, but you have to be very careful and walk a very cautious line when criticizing the officials of this one foreign country. How did that feel to you, having just lost your job because of it?
I mean, look, it's a known. I know that I was playing with fire, but to me, there's no point in being at an outlet like The Hill unless you're willing to use it to say the things that you're not allowed to say. And I know that I was testing their boundaries. You know, as I've explained, it's been a head-to-head fight almost every single day for the past 6 months to get the coverage that you've seen on the screen. But to me, it was worth it. And it's worth it to expose how intolerant outlets like this really are. Because remember, The Hill really gets a lot of traction out of this idea that it's not really corporate media. It's an online show. It was, you know, innovated by Crystal and Sagar, who have this amazing format of left and right and who are outside of the two-party dynamic, neither identifying as Democrats or Republicans, willing to challenge the political establishment and be very critical of it from both sides, both kind of outsider wings. And they cover a lot of issues that are about speech suppression. We covered the Twitter files extensively. We cover COVID misinformation. We covered all of those things extensively, and really sort of the show brands itself as being different from other sorts of corporate media. We don't censor. We cover people who are censored. We have, Matt Taibbi on. We have Ken Klippenstein on. You know, we have you on. And so I do think that alone is what kept me around so long, even as I was causing so much trouble internally. They were worried about the brand hit that they were going to take, especially after what happened to Katie Halper. So yeah, I don't, I mean, obviously I regret it insofar as I think it's important to have a left perspective on relatively mainstream platforms. That is why I was there. I think it's important, and that is a loss in and of itself. But I also think this is an important teaching moment, an important kind of reckoning moment about how powerful, and this is not, a trope or stereotyping. I'm talking about a news story that was reported this past week about an Israeli branch of government that has a social media campaign to influence U.S. lawmakers. This is what we're talking about here, the incredible influence of not just AIPAC as a lobby, but Israel as an institution in dictating America's media agenda and political agenda. And it should not be missed, by the way, that in both the pile-on that happened about a week ago over the debate that I did at the dissidents conference in New York, that debate happened a month ago. That clip was surfaced and circulated about a week ago by people like Richie Torres, who were one of the Congress members that the reporting about the Israeli influence campaign specifically says was involved. And he also was involved in surfacing and disseminating the eye roll clip, which is purportedly the reason why I've been fired, although of course that's not what the Hill has said. I really do think it was a pretext, given my long-standing commitment to covering truthfully what has been going on the ground in Gaza.
Is this one of those bizarre yet very revealing facts of American political life that Congressman Richie Torres, who represents the single poorest district in the United States, has decided to make defense of this foreign country on the other side of the world, who have millions of citizens who have a better standard of living than the people in his district, the number one cause? Obviously, he understands the converse of what happened to you, namely that if you become a fanatical Israel supporter, as he has become, it is very good for your political future. Before I let you go, let me just ask you, you obviously identify as a leftist. You are at the same time a harsh critic of the Democratic Party. There's a lot of speculation that Biden's ongoing support for Israel, which we now will know will last through Election Day and beyond, might endanger his re-election, because there are a lot of young people, a lot of Arab people, a lot of left-wing voters whose support he needs in key swing states like Michigan and others. How serious of a threat do you think that is? Do you think the left will snap into line like they usually do and vote for the Democrats, or do you think that this poses a serious threat to his support that he needs?
I do not think they will snap in line. There's obviously a contingent of folks who, to date, are still saying, yes, I'm very disappointed in him, but we've got to vote blue no matter who. But what has been really remarkable to see for me is that even people who were very critical of Biden, but who also said he's better than the alternative, have now changed their tune, who have changed their mind, because for them, a genocide, or what the ICJ has at least described as plausibly a genocide, is their red line. And, I'm alluding to my friends, Crystal and Kyle, who I have the utmost respect for. We had a public debate on their podcast, I think end of last summer, about whether or not the left should vote for Biden. I felt very strongly that they should not. This was before October 7th. But they felt, and they make a reasoned argument along these lines that I respect but disagree with, that because of certain labor gains, the improvement to the NLRB, those being building blocks for a bigger left movement, that it was worthwhile to vote for him. Now, post October 7th and post the 8 months now of ethnic cleansing that we've seen in Gaza, they do not feel that way. And I admire that shift, and I very strongly agree with it. I'm so glad that we're all on the same page. But to me, that speaks volumes, that very intelligent people made a reasoned argument and said at one point, yes, even knowing all of the critiques more than most folks, because who criticizes Biden more than people like Crystal and Kyle? Very, very few. That they still felt like there was like a kind of political argument to voting for him then, but not now. And if they have had that shift, being as informed and knowledgeable as they are, I think that's indicative of how over it so many other players are. You cannot see the actual headless infants, the record number of amputee children, the blatant disregard for cemeteries, 16 cemeteries being dug up by the IDF. What is the claim there? That Hamas is under the dead? 6 feet down, that there's tunnels under the cemetery. It's so flagrant that to the extent that anybody thinks that Biden should win because we got to quote unquote defeat fascism or defeat Trump or whatever, the argument has to be that it's incumbent on Biden to change his position to earn those votes back. Because I think very few kind of moral thinking, feeling, seeing people can look up at the Democratic argument that Biden is better than the alternative and really have a clear picture of that being true when he's the one that's funding and facilitating the genocide that we've been watching for the last 8 months.
Yeah, it's very strange to hear people say, I think Joe Biden is guilty of being complicit in genocide, and it's extremely important we do everything possible to keep him in power. I mean, I don't see how any minimally moral person could possibly join those two statements together. Bree, before I let you go, what is it that you are doing now? Where can people find you and support your work?
Well, I have always been living my life like my podcast, Bad Faith, is my primary job, and I will continue to do that. So you can get free episodes of Bad Faith every Thursday, and you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast to get an additional premium episode on Mondays. You can follow Bad Faith on Bad Faith YouTube. You can follow me at BreeJoy on Twitter, and I will be posting about new upcoming projects as well. So please do follow me and stay tuned, because I have been wanting, frankly, to have more space in my schedule to get back to some writing projects, and I anticipate starting those soon.
Briahna, it's always great to see you. You know I have the utmost admiration and respect for what you do, and I'm actually kind of glad in a way that your firing is so obvious that it was because of your views about Israel, because it really makes manifest the actual culture in the United States when it comes to free speech and free discourse. And I appreciate your coming on, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I appreciate you too.
Have a good evening. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.